I'm well aware of the fact that we, for the last few weeks, have been dealing with a lot of very technical, detailed material. We won't continue this way indefinitely, but I feel that it's really necessary, since we weren't all majors in science in college, and if you don't already have some of the background in this area, then some of the things concerning creation and concerning the flood, all the various aspects at which we have looked, really will not make a lot of sense to you, since we don't have whole lengthy passages to give you on each one of these things. You simply have to know something about the earth and something about science before it'll make a lot of sense to you. And so this evening we're going to be again on another technical subject, but I'll try to spare you of some of the details. There'll have to be some into which we go, but I'll spare you a lot of the details because it can get very complicated and could take up, well, people have PhD degrees in what we're going to try to say here in an hour. And so that just shows you that it's more complicated than I know or than I want to get into, and I certainly feel it would be the same as far as you are concerned. Now, in our last message, we left you with the question of the location of the water's deposition. And we had begun answering that question. We said there were two answers to it, that since we've got waters in Noah's day that cover the entire globe, chapter 7, cover all the high hills, cover all the mountains, and we know that this amount of water is not present with us today as far as covering any high hills or any mountains, something happened to it. Amen. Now, we did away with the theory that there was a plug in the bottom and they pulled the plug. And the earth, its atmosphere can't contain the water that it once contained. We know it's not up there today. If it were there, we would know it. If there were a 40-foot thermal blanket in the thermosphere, we would know it, very obviously. But it's not there. We would have a lot of profound effects of that upon the earth. It's not there. So the water that came up from the fountains of the deep and that came down from the floodgates of heaven had to end up somewhere. Now, we know initially it covered the whole globe. But the problem is it's not covering the whole globe today. 29% of the surface of the globe is now not covered by water, as opposed to 0% in Genesis 7. 0% was not covered by water. In other words, 100% was covered by water in Genesis 7. 71% is still a large portion, but it's nowhere near 100%. We couldn't be alive here on the globe today if that water were still where it was in the time of Noah. Okay, and we had begun by giving you one of the final locations for the deposition of this water, and that was the polar caps, North Pole, South Pole, polar caps. Now, after a short period of time, the rain that was falling universally, chapter 7 and verse 11, we've looked at many times before, which also, of course, if it's falling universally, was falling at both of the poles. Within a short time after it began to fall, then the precipitation turned from the form of rain into the form of snow and ice, and continued to come down North Pole, South Pole, but no longer came down as liquid water. It came down thereafter as snow and as ice. Then, not long after that, our modern cycle, our modern water cycle of evaporation, condensation, and precipitation would have set in. Now, we haven't covered this. All we've covered is what I just gave you there in one sentence. We're on new material here. But we didn't have a water cycle as we know it today prior to the flood, because you had no rain, you had no precipitation. So you did not have the regular, normal threefold water cycle of evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. The waters evaporate from some source, then they condense out from water vapor into a precipitable form, and then they precipitate. So you go through evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Now, not long, I say, after the floodgates of heaven open and the fountains of the deep are broken up, then we have this cycle set into motion which then begins to take some of the waters that have fallen, let's say, at the equator in the oceans by means of evaporation out. Then it condenses out over the poles and precipitates again as ice or as snow. If we keep it just with what I've said there at the beginning, that after a short period of time the rain over the poles changed to snow and to ice, that still doesn't help us with what happened to all the water that ended up in the oceans in some place besides the North Pole and the South Pole, because it would have still covered the whole globe. You see, just because the rain that came down at the poles turned to ice, that doesn't affect what's going on down at the equator. You've still got the same volume of water that's precipitating there. You're still going to have the earth, the globe, all her high hills and all of her low mountains covered. Unless, after a short period of time, the water cycle begins to set in. Now, of course, this would, when I say a short period of time, I don't mean like a couple of days or a couple of months. We're talking about years when all of this took place. Our whole study tonight is not going to be around several days or several months, but over years, over centuries, as a matter of fact. Because remember, the Earth's atmosphere would have been saturated, and it could not have evaporated any water. But as time went along, it would begin to evaporate. You'd have the wind systems now that are on the Earth, Genesis 8, verse 1, carry this water vapor to the poles, and it would precipitate as snow, as ice, and there you've got one of the places where a lot of the moisture ends up. Now, at this time, a state of terrific imbalance existed in the environment, in the Earth's environment, due to several things. First of all, due to the excessive amount of water that had heretofore not been on the globe. Imbalance resulting also from the lack of the thermal blanket in the Earth's atmosphere. Imbalance resulting from the increased solar radiation that the Earth is now experiencing. Imbalance caused by the terrific wind systems that exist. Imbalance caused by the extremes in temperature. Imbalance caused by the terrifically barren topography on the globe. And on and on and on. I'm just giving you a list of some that you can think of off the top of your head that would cause an imbalance in our Earth's environment. It had never been like this before. And no longer do we have a tranquil, peaceful environment. But you've got all of the land systems which have been changed, as well as the weather systems. Now, as a result of this imbalance in the Earth's atmosphere and its environment all over the whole globe, then these ice caps at both of the poles would have continued to grow. You would have had, with the water cycle and the exchange of water from the warm seas into the atmosphere and finally into the polar region as snow and ice, with this process taking place, then your polar caps are going to continue to grow larger and larger and larger. And as they grow larger, simply the force of gravity is going to pull them from your pole region and cause them to begin to spread out away from the poles. Now, they're not going to go back to the poles. That's where all the ice is. But what causes the move of glaciers is the same thing that causes the move of water, and that's gravity. Water never goes uphill. Water only comes downhill. Glaciers only come down. And I don't mean like down the side of the globe, because gravity, remember, is working this way, not on the side of the globe. But nonetheless, gravity is still what causes glaciers to come down from their heights in the mountains where we see them today. You see, glaciers still exist today. We don't have a great problem with glaciers as such. It's just with some of the glacial theories. Now, as these began to grow, then they would begin to spread out over vast regions where no ice had ever been before. It's been hypothesized that half of Europe, as well as all of North America, was at one time covered by huge continental glacial sheets of ice, several 100,000 square miles wide and several thousand miles thick. That would have gone all the way down into Siberia, that would have covered half of Europe and covered all of North America. Now, we should all be familiar with this hypothesis from grade school or from wherever we heard some things about the famous Ice Age theories of the past. The Ice Age, the glacial theories, are only as recent as the year 1822. It's only been about 150 years ago that a Swiss engineer, after studying some of his glaciers in his own homeland, of course in the Alps in Switzerland, hypothesized what's become famous since that time as the glacial theory. And generally what is held is a multiple glaciation theory where we've got at least 4 stages of glaciation or 4 ice age periods. Now, some will hold that there are 5 periods. Some will hold that there are maybe as many as 6, 7, 8 periods of glacial activity where you've got unexplainably, it's again one of those things that's not happening today. North America's not being covered by glaciers. So it's not something that can be measured. It's not something that can be demonstrated. It's not something that can be repeated. But nonetheless, it is a scientific theory dreamed up in 1822, where you've got over the process of millions of years an ice age that will set off tremendous movements on the Earth's surface of tremendous quantities of ice, and we don't really know what, or they don't really know what set it off. They don't really know what stopped it either, but it went so far, it covered North America, and then something happened to it, and it began to retreat and went back. And this is what caused the death of the dinosaurs and cavemen and stuff like that that lived in places like Europe and North America. And then you'd have a relatively warm climate for the next several million years. Following that, another glaciation period that would again last several million years, with glaciers extending down through Europe and through North America. These were the primary places where it extended. There are 3 great regions in Canada where you've got the names of 3 different glaciers that supposedly originated and came down and covered all of North America. Then after this second glacial period, again you've got a warming trend, unexplainable, but nonetheless a warming trend, followed again by several million year period, then again by another ice age time period, and so forth, until we get to our present age. But that's not the end of their hypothesizing, because we're now being told that the Earth will again, North America that is, be covered by a tremendous ice age period in 2.5 million years. So none of us, of course, have to be concerned about that. And they say that after this next great period of glaciation, then finally glaciers and snow and ice will cover the whole globe and all of life will cease to exist. And it's interesting that the scriptures have just the reverse, that the earth will be burned up by fire, by heat, rather than by cold. But that's the theory, that after our next period of glaciation in 2.5 million years from now, the whole globe will permanently be covered by these huge 1,000-mile thick glaciers, and all life will cease to exist. If you've got that much ice on the surface of the earth, it's understandable why life would cease to exist. Now, this is universally what is held, just like evolution, uniformitarianism, and a lot of other scientific theories, is the multiple glaciation ice age theory. That we've got at least 4 of these that extend, as I say, through North America, through part of Russia, through half of Europe. Unexplainable as far as their origin is concerned, unexplainable as far as their termination is concerned. I think the most popular glacial theory today is known as the solar topographical theory, that is held by a glacial geologist at the University of Yale, known as the solar topographical theory. And it has a lot of what is held by that theory. You can tell by the name what he's talking about. Solar, that has to do with either the presence or the absence of solar heat and radiation from the sun, topography, the terrain of the earth. And I just gave you some things earlier in explaining why and how we had a state of imbalance at this time period. And that happened to be two things: an increase in radiation from the sun and a terrific deformity, topographically speaking, of the Earth's surface. Remember now that after the flood, after you've got the flood ending, you've got barren, everything is barren, because it's annihilated all life forms, all creation. It's annihilated everything. And you're going to have a gradual, slow process of building up after that. Now, our only comment that we can make about the four-fold period of glaciers is the following, and that is all evidence, even scientifically, points to one ice age and one only. Now, I'm not going to get into all the ways that you can tell that there has been this movement of continental ice sheets, but you have a tremendous, they're like scratches in rock that have been caused, and it's not like east and west, it's all north and south. And it comes from the poles, and it doesn't extend down to somewhere like Central America, just in Canada, it's just in North America, or you can go down to the bottom of the globe, where these great, huge sheets of ice began to either descend or ascend on the globe, depending on how you're looking at it. And it began to cut these indentations into rocks. And we've got them right here in this state. As a matter of fact, the greatest glaciers of this country, or of North America, of this continent, came through the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin. That's how we got the lakes that we have in this region. There's nowhere else around this country that you have the lakes as you have Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Great Lakes. Because you see, with the retreating ice, what do you have left? Melting water that formed all of the lakes. Now, the onset and the conclusion of this one ice age period can only be understood with a knowledge of the components of the Earth's atmosphere. And I've given you those three major components before. The onset and the conclusion of the ice age can only be understood by means of a knowledge of the atmospheric components. Those being the following. First of all, water vapor. Secondly, ozone. Ozone is caused by the sun's ultraviolet rays and its reaction to oxygen and to water molecules. And thirdly, and most importantly for what we're considering now, CO2, carbon dioxide. Now, it's important that you remember whatever you can remember, because we're going to answer the whole question now of glaciers and of an ice age. Yes, there was an ice age, but there was only one. How far it extended, we can't be certain unless we take the statistics of the geologists that will tell us, as I've said before, that it extended down through North America, down through Europe, down through part of northern Siberia and Russia. And if we don't take their statistics, we really have no idea of how far. Obviously, it didn't cover the whole globe, or we would have had what they're predicting, the annihilation of all life forms on the planet. And since that didn't happen, we couldn't have had ice covering the whole globe, but because of all of the evidences that we have, and I'm not going to go into those geologic evidences, you can study it on your own, but because of the very obvious evidences that we have to adopt at least one ice age, and the evidence of Scripture as well as the statistics of science points towards the necessity of only one ice age. We have to adopt that in order to correlate the facts of the Earth's history with what we've been provided in the Scriptures. Now, water vapor, ozone, carbon dioxide are the three major components of the Earth's atmosphere. Now, the water vapor, remember, was the most important pre-flood component of the atmosphere, because that's what caused the waters above the expanse effect back on the second day of creation in Genesis chapter 1. Now, as the water vapor condensed and began to precipitate, then it would have carried with it as it fell, and this does and can happen, or can and does happen to get it in the right order, it would have carried with it the molecules of carbon dioxide, many of them, not all, but many of them, as well as the molecules of ozone, which means that not only would the water vapor canopy have condensed and precipitated, which means not only would the Earth have lost in its atmosphere a lot of its water vapor, which it did, but it also would have lost much of its molecules of ozone as well as carbon dioxide. Now, the important one as far as we're concerned right now is carbon dioxide. You see, there is no problem with an onset of the glacial period. If what we've said is true, and there doesn't seem to be any indications that what we've said is not true and is not the case, where you've got the turning into polar caps, the regions at the North and South Pole, and with the imbalance in the Earth's atmosphere, you've got an accumulation of ice and of snow in these regions. And as they accumulated, they gained strength, and as they gained strength, they would begin to slide southward from the North Pole and northward from the South Pole. If all this is true, then there's no problem with the Ice Age period as far as its onset is concerned, because the flood helps us explain that. There had never been a time where we've got the imbalance in the Earth's atmosphere like we have after the flood, as well as during the flood, but especially after the flood. So it's really no problem as far as the onset. The problem is what caused the glacial period to stop. What we've said thus far about the flood answers the question how and why and by what means it originated. But the way in which it concluded is another matter. But I believe that's fairly easy to explain as well. Carbon dioxide, CO2, is placed into the Earth's atmosphere from two major sources. First of all, from the exchange of the gases in the oceans with air above the seas. Then you've got an influx of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere. Now remember how much water we've got out there, so we've got the availability of a lot of carbon dioxide. And secondly, and probably the way that most of us are more familiar with, of course, is through plant life, as well as animals. You see, plant life breathes in carbon dioxide by means of photosynthesis, and by means of the perspiration of plants or other methods, animals as well as plants deposit CO2 back into the Earth's atmosphere. Now you've got to keep this in mind along with this. Remember, the only animals that we have left alive on the whole planet are in Noah's Ark. And all the plants and all the trees have been destroyed. We've got a terrifically barren topography all over the globe. It's all barren. So over the process of several hundred years, with the multiplication of animals and with the new life growth of the plants, then you've got more animals being, more population of animals, you've got more plants on the earth, therefore you've got the availability of more carbon dioxide, and this is exactly what happens as you have an increase in your plant life as well as in your animal life, and as well as your human life. They begin to put off carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, which goes up into the Earth's atmosphere, and guess what it does? It acts like a shield similar to the water vapor canopy in the pre-flood era. Now what does that tell you? The more carbon dioxide you're going to get into the atmosphere, the greater the shield will be in the atmosphere. The less able the sun's radiation will be able to penetrate that shield. And consequently, you're going to have just a partial, and be sure you don't misunderstand me, just a partial restoration of a greenhouse effect in the earth. Without any atmospheric components up there, the sun is going to hit the earth and its rays are going to reflect right back off into outer space. And you would have no warmth whatsoever. You need something that once the sun has penetrated through it, carbon dioxide and the small water vapor that we have in the Earth's atmosphere now, once it's penetrated through that, reaches the Earth's surface, bounces off, which is what it does, most of it can't get back out of our atmosphere because of the shield that holds it in. Now this, of course, will result in a very rapid warming up of the climate of the whole globe. You see, after the flood for several hundred years, it must have been extremely cold in many portions of the earth. Now, it wouldn't have to be at the equator, obviously. It wouldn't have to be in Bible lands. So we have no problem with Noah still being able to raise a vineyard in Genesis 9 and get drunk on the grapes or on the wine that he made from the grapes as a result of his growing the vineyard. Grapes can't grow if it's too cold, so we can't have a cold temperature in Mesopotamia. We've got to have it warm there. But the temperatures, remember, at the poles went down several hundred degrees below zero. Now, of course, they've bounced back up since then. What caused that? You see, it's not several hundred. It's not 300 degrees below zero at the poles. What's caused it to bounce back up? The shield, the same carbon dioxide, CO2 shield that we're talking about. Now, you see, people that don't believe in what the Scriptures teach about a flood, they've really got no answer for what caused the cessation of the glacial period or what caused the ceasing of the Ice Age epoch. And we've got an answer. Because, you see, the thing that we had to have in order to get the ozone and carbon dioxide to fall from the Earth's atmosphere was the water vapor canopy. Because as it fell, it would carry other molecules along with it down to the Earth. And that's exactly what it did, and that's exactly what the Scriptures inform us by implication that it did. So, consequently, as we go along in time, we've got a gradual restoration of CO2 to the Earth's atmosphere, which places intact a carbon dioxide shield, really a shield of absorption that helps absorb the sun's radiation, which, in effect, raises the temperatures back up slightly, which brings a cessation to the Ice Age. Very easy to explain. And it didn't take 5 years of postgraduate study to understand it.
Thank you, Jesus. Hallelujah.
Now, as the ice sheets would have slowly begun to retreat, of course, by melting, they didn't actually back up or anything, but it looks like they're retreating because the southernmost edge of it begins to melt, and it looks like they're retreating. So we generally speak of these great glacial, continental glacial sheets as retreating glacial continental sheets. As they began to come in contact with lower latitudinal zones, the temperature would be higher. As a result, they would begin melting. We would have formations of lakes like we have in this state, as well as the Great Lake region. And as well, we would also have a separation between the organisms, the life forms that were perhaps more adapted by means of inbuilt instincts after the flood that God had placed in certain animals, those more adapted to the cold as the ice sheets began to retreat back north, then so would the animals that were adapted to that. And those that were not adapted would have remained, in our southern regions. For example, the polar bear. You see, he became an animal by things built into him after the flood. You see, after the flood, we don't have a white polar bear that loves it where it's cold because it's not cold in Mesopotamia. And how do you think he's going to survive getting out there in the old hot plains of Iran and Iraq? He's not going to last very long. But over the whole period, this several century period of the early history of the earth, these animals would have been led North Pole, South Pole, in that region, not all the way to the pole. They could have been just led up into northern Europe, or even right where we are in North America. But as the glaciers began to recede and retrace their steps going back north, then so would the animals that were adapted for that climate. And probably, no one knows about this, but probably this is when any color changes, any food changes would have been enacted in them supernaturally. Otherwise, we don't have any explanation for certain features that these animals have that live in cold regions when they came originally from a warm, more or less hot, tropical region, Iran, Iraq area. Something had to have caused a change in them, biologically speaking, in order for them to be able to adapt to the cold weather that we see them adapting to today. And the best way to explain that is the retreat of the glaciers. So we've got a color change in the animals, and we've got a cleavage between those that are more adapted for colder climate and those more adapted for a warmer climate. Now, along with this comes a gradual shift back toward a level of equilibrium, where you've got the temperature now at the poles beginning to increase, getting back up to a comparable level where we find them today. They simply don't get as cold as they were at one time, cold enough to freeze a polar bear right in his tracks. That's where the polar bear lives. But yet, remember in our studies about the Siberian mammoths, it was so cold it was able to freeze them right in their tracks, right where they were. That had to be extremely cold, temperatures that we don't have on the globe anymore. But remember, it takes a process of hundreds of years to get enough carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere to act as that shield, which will begin to retard some of the reflection of solar radiation. And as the process of retardation increases, then the temperature likewise begins to increase.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
But remember, it takes a process of hundreds of years to get enough carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere to act as that shield, which will begin to retard some of the reflection of solar radiation. And as the process of retardation increases, then the temperature likewise begins to increase. Okay, along with that, the melting, and of course you've still got snow going on up north at the same time, but the melting, then it begins to get a little warm, then it comes wintertime again, melting again. Then this is what has left us with our great ice sheets like we have in Antarctica and Greenland. These are the two primary places that are spoken of as having huge glacial sheets of ice, Antarctica and Greenland. Smaller ones are found in Scandinavia and the island of Iceland. Now that, dear friends, is just how simple it is to discuss something, as long as you've got some type of basis, some type of foundation already in the Word of God. Because as I say, people are spending years dreaming up a multiple glaciation theory, a package of theories really, without being able to explain how any of them started, nor with any explanation for what causes their abrupt cessation. And they will admit that. Something caused them to start automatically and to start abruptly. It wasn't just that it got a little bit cooler and a little bit cooler. It got cold all of a sudden. And they themselves know that at the North Pole, because of the remains that we have found, that at one time it was warm there. What caused it to get cold? Solar topographical theory, or whatever new theory they might invent. They really have to invent theories because they really don't know what caused it to get cold suddenly like that. And what's even more of an enigma to them is what caused it to stop. You see, North America couldn't have been as warm as it is now with these continental sheets of ice coming through her, or they would have all melted. So North America was cold at the time. It was an ice age. But then they stopped. Now, they couldn't have gone all the way to the equator. It was too warm there, but they went through North America, and then they stopped. But then what caused them to stop? What caused them to retreat? That's the question of what caused the temperature to rise. And they'll start saying things like we've covered before about an outer space invader that came too close to the Earth and caused something in the Earth's atmosphere that made the glaciers go back north. It warmed something up. A comet came by and burned all the ice away and lifted the temperature back up. But what caused it to stay back up, though? And then what caused it to fall again? You see, you get a problem if you believe in multiple glaciers, because you've got temperatures going up, then it falls. Then it goes up, then it falls. You see, up and down one time is no problem. The flood explains that. It went down, then it came back up, and it's been equilibrium ever since then. Now, if it happened more than once, then we've got a problem. Because we'd have to have multiple flood theory for multiple glaciation theory. And, of course, the Scriptures teach, Genesis chapter 9, God will never destroy the earth with a flood like that again. Okay, that is one place where waters ended up. Let's go on to the second place. So that should answer our theories of the Ice Age. Yes, there was an Ice Age that covered much of North America. But that's not what caused necessarily the death of all Cro-Magnon men and dinosaurs and so forth. Okay, so it'll be important that you know that and have some of your statistics and facts together so that it can be explained to someone understandably. In the second place, we have our enlarged ocean basins. Prior to the flood, the proportion of land to water was obviously much greater than it is today. And not only that, but the water that did exist in the primeval seas and oceans of the antediluvian period would have been much shallower than they are today. Remember that we have oceanic depths that go beyond the heights of the greatest continental upreaches, such as Mount Everest. That's how deep it is. Now, although we've got subterranean waters that are part of the deep, the actual basin of the ocean itself would be much more shallow than what we have today, and the percentage of water would have been much smaller in comparison today. Remember, I've given you this figure before. 71% of the Earth's surface today is covered by water. Now, 71% is an inconceivably high figure for water coverage of the globe when the very purpose for making the earth is so that man and animals could populate it. That would really be ridiculous for God to have created the earth and made only 29% of it a region that could be populated by man and animals. And then he said, go out and populate the whole earth, where you could say, well, Lord, the whole earth, there's not much to populate. Most of it's water. So 71% is inconceivably high. The percentage must have been a lot lower. What, we don't know. But remember, we discussed last week that there's been a change in the structure and the outline of the continents. And very obviously, more of what is underwater now was above water prior to the flood than what we see today, which would mean we've got more land space available, less water available, and you've got seas and ocean basins that are more shallow. All right, how do we know that the ocean basins are really the final place of deposition, one of two final places for deposition of the flood waters? How do we know that? Well, we know it for several reasons, and I know we haven't even used our Bible here in a couple of weeks, but now if you'll go back to Genesis 8, I got through last week, and I don't remember now, but I don't think that we ever even opened to a text. But we will tonight. We finally got to a place where we can open to a text tonight. The Bible doesn't talk any about carbon dioxide. But it does talk about enlarged ocean basins. Now our passage for this will be Genesis 8, verses 1 to 5. And it's very clear that by several different methods we can prove that one place where the waters ended up would be the enlarged ocean basin. Now by enlarged I mean not only width-wise, but depth-wise as well. Both of these would be included. And you see, if we get a greater ocean basin than what we had prior, then you can put more water in there, which means that's where some of the water can end up rather than where we are standing right here this evening. Rather than being here, it can be in an ocean basin that's enlarged. Now, prior to the flood, remember, you've got shallow seas and not very much water at that. If you've got a shallow sea and you begin to have a flood, then you don't have any extra room in your sea to put any more water. And the only place it can go is on dry land. And that's exactly what happened. It covered the whole globe. But if you can enlarge your ocean basins, make them wider, which means you're going to have to now take up some that was land, dry land before. It's going to go right over the boundaries now, or in the flood days, as well as make it deeper. Then you've got a greater basket, so to speak, into which water can be poured. And this is where, second place, where some of the water ended up. Now, if you look in chapter 8, verse 2, first reason why we know that the ocean basins are one of the two final places of deposition is because in Genesis 8:2, it speaks of the stopping up of the fountains of the great deep. Now, the stopping up of the fountains of the great deep implies a sinking of wherever these fountains were located. If you plug it up, then it probably sank lower than where it was prior to this time. Now, let's go back for a moment. Chapter 7 and verse 11. The 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, the windows of heaven were open. Now, we've used this term, this phrase, the fountains of the great deep, to refer to various subterranean or suboceanic locations of huge reservoirs and storehouses of a tremendous quantity and volume of water. Now, we said prior to what we're saying tonight that volcanoes certainly do and can fall under the designation of being a fountain of the great deep, because water is stored up in a deep place somewhere and it's brought forth by the volcanoes. However, if you go back to chapter 1 now and verse 2, you'll remember that the initial reference of deep, of the word deep here in Genesis 1:2, is to great oceanic depths, and specifically sub-oceanic depths, water that has been locked up underneath the floor of the ocean. Now, do you remember that we've said that before? That's how the word deep is used. It's always in the Old Testament has reference, when this word is used, tehom, it always has reference not to the mythological Babylonian sea monster Tiamat, but to great sub-oceanic or subterranean depths of water. But the primary reference is to oceanic waters. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then he goes on to say, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So deep what? Deep waters is what he's talking about. Which means that in chapter 7 and verse 11, the initial reference where it speaks of the fountains of the great deep broken up would have to be applied to the great depths found either in or beneath the oceans, as opposed to land volcanoes. Now, they can and are and were included. But the first and the primary reference has to go back to what the Hebrew word means, and it's talking about deep waters in the oceans. Now, what this means is that when we get to chapter 8 and verse 2, where it speaks of the fountains of the deep being stopped, then we've got huge places, whether they're volcanoes, whether they're simply cracks in the surface of the floor of the ocean. We've got these huge fissures being opened up, water coming out of them. Now, what's implied by saying that they stopped up after the period where God let the water come out is that when they stopped up, they would have somehow have sunk back down inside the earth, which would have done what? Enlarge an ocean basin, because this is where they're primarily found. Okay, secondly, if that's not good enough for you, it gets better as we go along. This is very interesting. We've mentioned the subject of wind before, but in Genesis 8 and verse 1, this is very interesting. I'll read the verse here and then make a comment. God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. I tell you what, before I do that, let's go back to chapter 7. verse 19, just to get the picture of what the floodwaters are doing as far as the globe is concerned. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Now that doesn't mean that the water was only 15 cubits deep, and it doesn't mean that the mountains were only 15 cubits high. It went up half of the height of the ark. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beasts and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and of all that was in the dry land died. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, the creeping things and the fowl of heaven. They were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And look at this peculiar phrase. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. All right, what do we have as far as coverage of the globe is concerned at the time period of Genesis 8:1? Are any mountains or anything showing? Do we have any dry land? No, everything is covered. Then how in the world can a wind passing over the waters of the world cause them to assuage? You say, oh, evaporation can't evaporate. Saturation points long gone, already been met. Then how in the world is a wind going to cause the waters to assuage? Now, one theory, remember, is that the wind, it was a supernatural outer space wind, blew the water off into outer space. That's right. That's worth laughing at. That's not true, obviously. That's not true. But if wind is causing the waters to assuage, then the only thing we can logically assume is that the wind blew the waters somewhere. Now, it can't blow it, to the right or to the left, because everything's covered by water. You can't blow water on top of water and then cause all that water to get so piled up high that down low you've got some dry land. But if you got a sinking of the ocean basins, which is what we've got by implication here, then the wind that begins to blow across the whole earth blows all the water off the continents back into the enlarged basins of the oceans and of the sea. It's the only explanation we can give for Genesis 8:1, unless you want to believe in the blowing into outer space. You see, if it can't evaporate, then how in the world wind is not going to affect the waters as far as their assuaging is concerned, unless the wind was the natural force used to blow the waters to a particular place. And if you still got the whole surface of the earth covered with water, a wind's not going to do you any good. It'll just blow one wave into the next wave. But if all of a sudden you've got a deepening of the present ocean basins and of the basins of the sea, then you've got a place where that water can go. You say, well, if it was deepened, then the water would just all flow there by itself. Well, sure, but that might have taken a long, long time to all ever get there. So to speed the process along, a supernatural wind is sent out. Now, by supernatural, I just mean a natural wind, but it was used for a supernatural purpose because it has to be blowing in the right direction to get the waters from the continents into the oceans. It couldn't blow from the oceans back to the continents. Would have to be blowing water off the surface of the continents into the enlarged ocean and sea basins. Okay, thirdly, from our same passage, how do we know that the ocean basins were enlarged? Thirdly, in verses 3 through 5, the going and the returning of the waters implies great ocean tides as the floor of the ocean sank beneath the weight of the water. All right, look in verse 3 and verse 5, and you've got to look to your margin to get really what the Hebrew says. So I'll wait for you to get down whatever you're writing, and you turn there and look. Genesis 8:3, and the waters returned. You see, verse 1 had already said now that the wind is passing over the earth and the waters assuaged. Still doesn't tell us where they went, what happened. We just know that they went back to the oceans. Verse 3, the waters returned from off the earth in going and returning, is what the Hebrew says, not continually, but in going and returning. In other words, you've got the water going, and some of it comes back. Well, what's that speak of? That speaks of the tides of the ocean. You see, as you've got the floor of the ocean sinking underneath the weight, you've got water coming in, just like you cause something to sink in your sink or in your bathtub. And you've got water that comes in, and you've got water that goes back out. And you've got water that comes back in, waters that go back out. And especially as far as the oceans are concerned, this would speak of the oceanic tides. The waters return from off the earth in going and returning. And after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. Verse 5, and the waters were in going and returning continually. So this happened a long time. So you have to tie this in with the second point we just gave you. It wasn't like you turned your vacuum cleaner around backwards rather than sucking out blows and all the water just blew off of there instantly. You've got wind that comes. Wind doesn't just blow at a consistent rate. It blows and then it lessens and then it blows and then it lessens. And that's the same what we have here. It would blow and then the water would go and then the tides would cause it to come back and it would blow. And that's why it takes a whole period and process of time. And that's why the scriptures say very graphically, not in our version except in the margin, that they were in going and returning. Not just they ran off continually. A continuous runoff means no return. It just continually is running off. But that's not what Moses said whenever he wrote Genesis 8, verse 3 and verse 5. He didn't say the waters went continually. He said they were continually going and coming, which implies a sinking of the ocean basins. In the 10th month, the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. All right, this brings us to another subject. If you've got a sinking down of part of the surface of the earth, then you've got to have an uprising somewhere else on the earth.
Hallelujah.
When you push your pillow down in one place, that material you pushed has to go somewhere. It rises up somewhere else. When you push down on your bed, it rises up somewhere else. So with a sinking of the oceans, then we're going to have a rising of what we have in the end of verse 5, the tops of the mountains were seen. Now see, no one has ever seen this before except, a few people who've studied in this area, but no ordinary Christian has ever seen this. They think, the mountains were just there, and the mountains were stationary, and they're waiting until all the water finally got below the top of the mountain. But you've got a twofold process going on. While you've got the sinking of the ocean basins and the water going and returning, since you've got the earth's part of the earth's surface, the sub-oceanic surface, being pressed down, you've got to have a bulge somewhere else. And where it bulges is in the tremendous mountain chains that we see. Now there are a lot of different theories on the origin of our mountains. Let me give you some of those theories before I get into what the scriptures teach on the subject. Some of the several theories of mountain building activity. First of all, there's the theory of volcanism, that ancient volcanoes are what caused all of our mountain chains. That's not generally held by many people. A second view is the continental drift view. Continents drifted, smashed into each other, and whenever they hit each other, mountains buckled up. That's not generally held. The two theories that are most popularly held are the following. First of all, the thermal contraction of the Earth's crust mountain building theory. Thermal contraction speaks of heat. You know what happens on your expressways whenever it's too hot in the summertime? They buckle. And you've got thermal action there. They buckle up. So, and this is the general view that's held by most people, that some heat in the surface of the earth caused part of its crust to buckle up. And it buckled up, Mount Everest, 30,000 feet high. Don't let them deceive you. And then a second view is the subcrustal convection current theory. Subcrustal convection current, which is similar, but you've got currents now of water that force the mountain chains up. And there are a lot of theories on mountains. I mean, what caused the Rocky Mountains to get there in the first place? And what caused the Appalachian Mountains to get there in the first place? And see, they're studying a lot about what caused these mountains to get there. Of course, the Appalachian chain is older than the Rocky chain because they don't have the jagged peaks. They've been worn off by weather. It sounds logical. The longer you've been there, the more worn your peaks would be. You wouldn't be jagged anymore. That's why the Alleghenies and the Appalachian Range, they're old mountains, millions and millions of years old. The Rockies have jagged peaks, and so they're relatively new. One of these theories, especially one of the last two, is generally held in determining what caused the mountain chains to be raised up as we've got them today. Now, I've said before that the mountains in the antediluvian world were a lot smaller than they are today. Probably on the average of 5,000-6,000 feet or something for the highest mountain on the earth. How do we know this? Well, let's just take Mount Everest, for example, around 30,000 feet, around 5 miles high. That's going to take an inexplainable, inordinate amount of water to ever cover Mount Everest, which is what Genesis 7 says happened. It covered all the mountains. Now, you get that much water, and it could never have been put into any ocean basins, no matter how large they are. We didn't have mountains 29,000 feet high like we have today. The mountains were a lot smaller, and that's how they got covered. The mountains have only grown after the flood. Or we could say as a result of the flood, because they grew as a result of the sinking of the ocean basins. Mount Ararat, which is mentioned in chapter 8 and verse 4, itself is over 3 miles high, 17,000 feet. Now, Noah landed up on top of that thing. The water didn't cover that in the beginning. Mount Ararat wasn't Mount Ararat as far as being 17,000 feet high. If it was a mountain at all, it was 4,000 feet high, 5,000 feet high, 6,000 feet high. Do you need a proof text for that? Well, turn over to Psalm 104.
Hallelujah.
Now, I want to show you the best proof text in Scripture to teach the recent uprise in our mountain chains. See, our mountain chains, like the great ones that we have in Italy, they have seashells on the top of them. It means water covered them at one time. But a lot of them, like the Swiss Alps, they're too tall for even Noah's flood to ever have covered them. We didn't have that much water on the globe. So the seashells got up there somehow. One theory, remember, is that pilgrims going to Jerusalem dropped seashells on the mountain on the way there. But there's shark bones found there, too. What are they carrying shark bones for? Besides that, more are found in California than Italy. And see, we know that there were crusades of Christian pilgrims going from Europe down to Palestine. Maybe they did drop some shells on the tops of the mountains. But who's migrating anywhere in California? The gold rush in 49, maybe, but they weren't carrying seashells with them. They were going to try to get rich. Psalm 104. Now, this is generally spoken of as being a reference to creation. And although it can contain references to creation, the primary reference, as I'll show you, is to Noah's flood. Verse 5. God laid the foundations of the earth that it should not be removed forever. Now, that might sound like creation, and it could secondarily have a reference to creation, but not primarily, not Genesis 1. Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. Now, verse 8, look what you have in your margin. And this is what the Hebrew says again. Thank God for the marginal references that are correct. The mountains ascend and the valleys descend unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Now, if you take that literally, then the mountains ascended, which means they grew. The valleys descended, which means they sank down, which also would be another reference for the sinking of the ocean basins. Now, you go to the next verse, and you've got a proof that he's not referring to creation. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. Now, that couldn't be referring to creation because there was no limitation set that the waters would not cover the earth because, in fact, in chapter 7, they do cover the whole earth. But in chapter 9, he did set a bound, and he said, never again will the waters cover the whole globe. So that has to be, in other words, referring to the flood period as opposed to creation. And when it says they go up by the mountains and down by the valleys, he's not talking now about the waters going up by the mountains and down by the valleys. He's talking about what's been said in the margin, that the mountains ascend and the valleys descend, and here you've got supernaturally the growth of all of our chains of mountains. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we'll say some more things next time on the same subject. Scriptures give us our answer.
Hallelujah. Praise God. Praise the Lord. Amen. Thank you, Jesus.
On that mountain, again, do they have proof today from science that the mountains were a lot shorter and lower than they were?
No. The mountain building theories are generally the theories of folding. They believe that with the breaking of the Earth's crust, whether it's by thermal action or whether it's by convection currents, that you've got a folding of the mountains. And that's one of the problems, because it does look like a folding of the mountains, which probably did exist because the flood would have redeposited material. And it looks like you've got a newer portion down at the bottom of the mountain. And if it really grew, then how did the newer portion get at the bottom and the older portion get at the top? Unless you believe in either the flood or in one of their theories, which the earth buckled, and that means it threw the bottom up to the top and brought the top down to the bottom, which explains, as far as they're concerned, the rise of mountain chains. But the Scriptures, on the other hand, give us the explanation, the true historical explanation for how they ascended. The Bible says that they simply ascended, which means God calls them supernaturally afterwards. Obviously, if you've got a sinking of one place, you have to have the rise of another. And we couldn't have had a 29,000-foot mountain covered by Noah's flood, not enough water. And that's what they laugh about. Oh, the flood could never be universal.
For a complete